Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome to the start of reading Rousseau's Social Contract. Today we're looking basically, I believe, chapters 1 through 4. Just getting it correctly. I might take my notes. Yeah, 1 through 4 of Book 1. My previous video gave us the introduction to the book. Now we're going to go running into it. We start out with the foreword. Okay? This is the forward. Maybe I should have dealt with the forward last time, but I talked about the forward in terms of Rousseau's. This was a product of the social contract was a product of a failed work. So let's continue this. Right, this short treatise is taken from a more extensive work, which I undertook in the past without considering my strength, and have long since abandoned. Of the various segments that could have been taken from what had been done, this is the most considerable and seems to me the least unworthy of being offered to the public. The rest no longer exists. Now, there's fragments that do exist. It's involved. You can see the Vaughan editions, or the Pelide collected works of Rousseau. They can find them. I believe there's been translations of them in various editions of certain works and certain translations. They should be available also in the collected works. The Dartmouth University Press complete the collected works of Rousseau, that which Roger Master helped set up and edited, and along with what's the professor at Christopher or something. My mind is blanking. At Boston College in the 1980s. I think they finished in the 1990s, early 20th century. And a lot of the stuff has been also available in paperback editions. So, okay, let's go book one. Book one, general theme, right? Book one. I want to inquire whether there can be a legitimate and reliable rule of administration and civil order, taking men as they are and laws as they can be. So therefore, I'm going to be making a thing about looking at whether there can be civil administration, legitimate, and reliable. Remember that two qualifications: legitimate, which means rightful, and reliable means continually is able to exist and perpetuate, not just for one moment but more than one time, right? Taking men as they are, not as they could be, and the laws as they can be. So what laws are possible, right? I shall try always to reconcile in this research what right permits, what justice permits, right permits, with the interest, what interest prescribes. So what right permits with he's always going to reconcile this. What interest prescribes versus what right presents. So this research will will always reconcile this, he says, so that justice and utility are not at variance. In other words, this is very interesting. He's not gonna go to Kant, which is going to take it that where the question of utility cannot be the basis of right. The question of one's utility in this question problematizes the question of right for Kant. For Kant, Rousseau, no, this is not the case in that sense. I start, like I said, 3 paragraphs here. This first paragraph, I start in without providing the importance of my subject. It may be asked if I'm a prince or a legislature, to write about politics. In other words, I reply that I'm neither, and that is why I write about politics. If I were a prince or a legislature, I would not waste my time saying what has to be done. I would do it or keep silent. Now, this is a famous criticism of Frederick the Great, who wrote this. Wrote a book about attacking Machiavelli, anti-Machiavelli, and also kind of criticism against Voltaire's shaping of Frederick in that sense. This is kind of it's a kind of making fun of it. If I'm a legislator, the sovereign, if I was a sovereign, or if I'm a legislature, I should keep silent. I should do. Now, the third thing, born a citizen of a free state, and member of its sovereign. The right to vote is enough to me to undo. Sorry, no, sorry. There is the right to vote is enough to impose on me the duty of learning about public affairs, no matter how feeble the influence of my voice may be. So there was very powerful thing. It says, just being a citizen of a free state and a member of its sovereign. Remember the idea of sovereign is that the citizen is this. The right to vote is enough to impose on me, to compel me to learn about public affairs, no matter how feeble my voice may be, right? He says, I am happy every time I meditate about government. I always find in my research new reasons to love my country. Now, again, this is this great line. In other words, I am happy every time I meditate. I actually share this. I mean, this is where I kind of feel I agree. I'm with Rousseau. Um, every time I meditate about governments, I always try to research the reason why I love my country. Well, not always these days, but this is that line in Rousseau that strikes home and that points to this. Now, chapter one, the subject of the book. Now, this is the famous sentence. And it was the first book. No, it's not the first part of the thing. The first part is the book of his foreword and this, right? It's the first sentence of the first chapter. And this is the problem of the is, was, or is, right? Man was or is, man is or was born free, and everywhere he's in chains. This is that great sentence that starts Rousseau's the argument of Rousseau's. Because um, now it's an important metaphor. What is it meant by that? Is that freedom of this? But then we see, in other words, we see man in the state of nature. The argument was the classic argument is free. Man is free originally, but now as we see them as in chains. But the question is, we always assume that we want to break from the chains, but this is not necessarily so. I think this is the point we have to go. This sentence misleads us to a degree. It leads us to believe that we should just be escaping the chains, right? Like this is a condition of, this is society, but it's a more complicated problem than this, right? Who are one who believes himself the master of others is nonetheless a greater slave than they. So therefore, in other words, that the masters of even the one who believes himself the masters of others, the rulers of others, right, the master of others, is a greater slave than the ones who are ruling, right? How did this change occur? In other words, I do not know. So in other words, this is the question. He's not going to answer the question. In other words, I don't know about how this change occurred. How did the change? In fact, we could argue that the change occurs between free and this, and the chains. Um, 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 how did this occur? We look at there is the argument in his second discourse. Okay, that's the second discourse we can argue. What can make it legitimate? I believe I can answer this question. So the question is not the anthropological question here about how did this occur, this move from man being free to man in chains. Does not know. He says, I don't know. Or at least for the subject of this book, here, he does not know. But he's going to what? He's going to make the question, this other question. What can make the chains legitimate? And this is, he believes he can answer this question. If I were to consider only force and the effect it produces, I would say as long as a people is constrained to obey and does so, it does well. So as soon as it can shake off the yoke, and it does even better. So therefore, in other words, this idea again, this idea of the yoke of this is that they're constrained. In other words, if they're produced only by force, if they're in other words, if they're going to be governed only by force, and in fact, it says, well, as long as people obey and does so, it does well. But then the second they can shake off the yoke, it does it does even better. So that same people does better under freedom than slavery, but they still do good. They're still able to do something. What he says, they, as long as the people is constrained to obey and does, it does well. It does well, but it will do if it can shake off its yoke and still maintain able to obey or to not through force. The yoke, the idea that they're constrained as a slave, right? For the recovering its freedom by means of the same right used to steal it. So therefore, either the people is justified in taking it back, or those who took it away were not justified in doing so. So that's a double meaning. Whereas the people can take it by the same way the people imposed it, then either the people are able, capable, or the first people had no right to take it in the first place, right? But the social order is a sacred right that serves as the basis for all the others. In other words, what is this sacred right he says here? That the social order is a sacred right that serves as the base. So he's basically agreeing with Aristotle in the sense that the political community, the political form, the social order is founded in the political community, the embodiment of the city in the Greek, right? The polis, the city. This serves as the basis of all the others. This is why politics is architectonic in Aristotle. And this seems to be suggesting a similar thing, that the social order is a sacred right, divine, right? Something divine. And that it serves as the basis of all other right. However, this right does not come from nature. Okay, this right does not come from nature. This is not a natural right. Political right is not natural. Again, this is where he is in agreement with Locke and Hobbes. It is therefore based on convention. This is where he breaks with Aristotle. Plato, that's another question. Maybe Plato he's more in agreement with. Because Plato has this idea the city is artificial, or city is a reflection of the natural. You never get that the city is by nature in Plato. I think Alan Bloom is right about this in Greek Law. It is wrong to attribute to Plato that he believes that the city is by nature. This has often led many Aristotelian scholars who agree, are kind of students of Strauss and are Platonists who want to think that Aristotle and Plato agree, will argue that, well, even Aristotle doesn't really mean it. That's an exoteric, that's a mob pleasing position. The real philosopher knows that this is all by convention, right? Nomos, not by phusis. Nomos phusis is a kind of contradiction in terms in a sense, right? But that's another question. That's you can go see my Aristotle discussions in book 3, book 1, where I kind of address this issue. But he's saying that it's not by this; it is by convention. The problem is to know what these conventions are. So therefore, it's not that we know. In other words, it's not by nature, but by convention. But the problem is we have to know what these conventions are. Before coming to that, I should establish what I've just asserted. So I'm going to talk about the assertion. Now he's going to go into the origins repeat his argument from, in many ways, summarize what he argued in the second discourse. So let's go to chapter 2 on the first societies. The most ancient of all societies, the only one that is, and the only natural one. Now, this is a natural society. Now, again, I think this is a very problematic word. I think there's a thing here. This is Rousseau talks about society, societas, but the problem with societas, is literally that this is it's contractual, and that's why I think he uses the word society, because in Roman law, societas was the contractual relation, the business relations. That the other relations of this polis was the communitas, which was like the Greek word koinonia, which implies not necessary voluntary origins of the thing. Therefore, that this is the involuntary aspect of it implies that there's something by nature. He does not. This is why he must use the word societas, society. because he wants to assert that with Hobbes that it's not natural. Well, society is not natural. Society is conventional because it's based on contracts, agreements. So therefore, this is why he says, but even the family is a natural one. So there's a contradiction that the natural society. So that's the use of the word society. This is the inherent contradiction in modern thought. That he understands that I think this is the Lockean mistake. Lockean does this purpose too, because this idea that the contract, marriage is and the family is a social, it's contract, husband and wife's contract. It's not a permanent social bond. It's a temporary social bond. The conjugal relationship is there, and it's contractual. The child raising, the rearing of it, is not a permanent relationship. There's no continued obligation, right? That's Locke. Go see my Locke videos on this point. Locke series on this point. John Locke's second treatise. He says what? Yet children remain bound to the father only as long as they need him for self-preservation. Again, this is agreeing with Locke. This is very much agreeing with what Locke says in second discourse. As soon as this need ceases, the natural bond dissolves. Again, this is very much Locke. The children exempt from the obedience they owed their father, and the father exempt from the cares he owed his children. All return to independence, back to the state of nature, in that sense, right? If they continue to remain united, it is no longer naturally but voluntary, and the family itself is maintained only by convention. Right? This is again even the family itself, which is based on natural things, but it's only maintained by this conception because of societas, by convention. Second paragraph. This common freedom is the consequence of man's nature. So this common freedom, this freedom of man that's free from everything else, is the consequence of man's nature. His first law is to attend his own preservation, right? Self-preservation. His first cares are those he owes himself. And as soon as he has reached the age of reason, right, the age of reason, as he alone is the judge of the proper means of preserving himself, he becomes his own master. So everyone becomes self-master. Again, this is very much Locke. This is very much agreement with Locke, and I'm going to say in this sense, right? The family is therefore, so to speak, a prototype of political societies. Ooh, so it's very interesting. The family is because of how he's drawing it, the family is a prototype of political society. The leader is like a father. The people are like the children. And since all the born equal and free, they only alienate their freedom but for their utility. So they alienate and give up, they transfer, they give away or take away their freedom for their utility. So they surrender freedom for utility. That's the choice. Freedom is they possess by nature, but they want utility. They want something. They want some good. They want something beneficial. And they will sacrifice their freedom for their utility. The entire difference is that in the family, the father's love for his children rewards him for the care he provides. So therefore, even though this is the prototype, there's a difference. The father's love, this is interesting now, Rousseau talks about this, the father's affection, the father's love of his children rewards him for the care he provides. So the love is a reward. Okay, the father's love. Is it love for the children? Yeah, that it rewards him. And how does it reward him? It rewards him by their love back to him, their mutual respect, and their future things. No. Whereas in the state, the pleasure of commanding substitutes for this love. Which the leader does not have for his people. Which the leader does not have for his people. It's love. It's commanding that in the state that the people is substitutes for love, and the leader does not have love for his people. Well, that's interesting. This is should a leader have act like a father? He doesn't. I think this because he's not like the father. Therefore, since he does not have love, a good father would love his children, would care for his children. So therefore, this is it, how can it be a prototype? There's a contradiction in this sentence here. In that sense, if the family is a prototype, and this leads us to a problem. If you say it's a prototype, then aren't we falling into the patriarchal argument of Filmer and gang? Right? It's the patriarchal argument this would lead us to this that Locke in his first treatise kind of does away, and in his introduction to his second treatise summarizes his argument against, right? Rousseau seems to be at one level suggests it, but then the second part is that no, it's not. It's not like it is. The family's prototypical. I think it's because of contractual, how he defines it, like in a sense. Um, um, but at the same time, the difference is love. The father loves his children. The ruler of the state does not. There's no reward. The pleasure of commanding substitute love. It's an interesting point. Rousseau talks about that. What the father has love for his children, the pleasure of commanding. This is something that's domination. This is what Kojève would point to, right? The pleasure from dominating. But that's mastery, right? How is political rule, the ruling of a state, a form of mastery, not a form of politics? Well, that's a very interesting point that Rousseau hints here in the language, right? Now he goes, Grotius denies that all human power is established for the benefit of those who are governed. He denies that, in other words, but this is the problem. He denies that all human power is this, right? He said, human power cannot be this because slavery is a form of human power. And slavery, he cites slavery as an example. Now, I don't think Grotius is positively citing slavery. Rousseau is implying that he does, everything slavery. But didn't he just, right up here, imply the same thing? Not for love, but of commanding others? Hmm. Grotius, however, argues that no, it's not all. In other words, denies that all human power is because he's basically saying that listen, there is a form of human power that is not based on the benefit of the governed. Okay, contrary to it, in that sense, like this, right? Again, Platonic argument is on art always benefits the thing that it's sake for. That the art of politics is therefore the art of justice is the benefit the ruled, not the ruler, right? But Rousseau, he's saying that Rousseau puts in Grotius that this is he belongs the example of slavery of this. His most persistent mode of reasoning is always to establish a right by fact, right? He wants to do this by fact. If there's going to be a right, we're going to. Grotius' persistent mode of reasoning is always look at what is, and that again is very Machiavellian. What is? But he said what is in that sense, right? I'm going to give remember the beginning point about this all the way at the beginning of the last chapter. One could use a more rational method, but not one more favorable to tyrants. Okay, so therefore, this is a very sarcastic remark that only tyrants would use this idea that we look at what is to dress at what is one more favorable to tyrants. We could use a more rational method, but not one more favorable to tyrants. Right? This idea. Now, I would argue, would go back up here. Isn't this the same thing? I'm going to take men as they are, right? I'm going to take men as they are. I'm going to not as how they will be, right? Um, that famous line up here, right? I'm going to take men as they are. I'm not going to, do this something other way. I'm going to uh, uh, take men as they are and laws as they can be, right? That's very interesting. And justice and utility, not invariance, okay? Here, there is kind of an argument that he wants to say that for Grotius it is. So therefore, he's applying Grotius a tougher standard that he applies himself. It is therefore doubtful, according to Grotius, whether the human race belongs to 100 men, or whether these 100 men belong to the human race. And throughout his book, he appears to lean towards the former view. This is Hobbes' sentiment as well. Thus, the human species is divided into herds of livestock, with each with its leader, who tends it in order to devour it. Now, I don't think this is unfair. This is a misleading. Rousseau is being very unfair, both to Hobbes. He knows Hobbes doesn't argue this. He knows Grotius doesn't argue this. So therefore, there is something. He's lying here. He's dissembling. He's giving kind of a caricature of Grotius and Hobbes to suggest that he's really not talking about. He's talking about slavery. That all political rules are mastery. But no, he just only gave example of mastery as a thing to discredit the idea that everything is for the sake of the government. We have to understand that political, in other words, that there's different types of rule. Gorgias is arguing there in his political right about the different realities of, again, taking men as they are and political system as they are, and laws as they can be. The laws themselves, how we can make them better. Right? That's the man as he is, but then the laws how they may be or can be. Is that meaning possible? That's the can be and may be. This is the ambiguity there in Rousseau, the French ambiguity. That may means here, or can be here means what's practical, but also can mean how they can be best, right? How they can be ideal, right? So not as they are, but how they should be in that sense, right? A herdsman's nature is superior to that of his herd. So shepherds of men, who are their leaders, are also superior to their people. Um, the Emperor Caligula reasoned thus, according to Philo, concluding rather logically from this analogy that the kings were gods, or the people were beasts. Right? The gods were kings or rulers were gods, and the people were beasts. Now, there's a note here, back up here. I missed it, but established by fact, he would make this now. Learned research on public right is often merely the history of ancient abuses. So people have gone to a lot of trouble for nothing when they have bothered to study it too much. Treatise on the Interest of France in relations to her neighbors by Marquis d'Anzeran. Right. This is exactly what Grotius has done. So blames Grotius for this kind of view. Right. In other words, abuse what people have gone through trouble. In other words, that political right is often merely the ancient abuses, right? Therefore, we just trouble to bother to study it much. We had a little interruption, but it's okay. So now it continues. Caligula reasoning amounts to the same thing that of Hobbes and Grotius. Now, guilt by association. This is wonderful, right? Before any of them, Aristotle too had said that men are not naturally equal, but that some are born for slavery and others for domination. Again, it's interesting that he basically, but then he goes, Aristotle was right, but he mistook the effect for its cause. Well, that is not even the correct statement. Okay, again, I think he's accusing that Caligula is talking about man of God and one of beasts. Now, Caligula's reason is the same, amounts to the same thing that of Hobbes and Grotius. This idea of ruler and ruled. Again, I think Rousseau is being purposefully inflammatory. This is the concept. This is the style. This is style getting ahead of argument, kind of a deceptive argument. He's trying to use style and use prejudice as a way to get people to not pay attention to something he's doing here. And there's something there. This is why this is what pisses people off over so. The more his style and his way of doing it is appealing to the prejudice of here the Democratic man, maybe aristocratic man, and he kind of does it like this. But then he has this thing about where he was right, but he mistook the effect for the cause. So what is this? Every man is born in slavery, is born for slavery. Nothing could be more certain. So therefore, the condition. So again, remember the change. The problem is that if societies has changed, his metaphor of chains and society, and how you're going to legitimize it. And the argument is legitimized through consent. The problem of slavery is not chains; it's that it's done through coercion, not consent. Aristotle's account of natural slavery is that there are people who lack foresight and don't have the ability and are not capable of self-ruling, and that they're better when they're only able to achieve their full humanity when they are ruled by others. Not when they're incapable of ruling themselves. They're incapable of ruling themselves. Again, this is see my Aristotle's my series on Aristotle, book one, particularly when I talk about this whole question of the natural slave in book one, in chapter four, I think. Yeah, chapter four of book one. So, I mean, slaves lose everything in their chain. So, therefore, they cause and effect, right? The argument is that every man born in slavery is born for slavery. Nothing could be more certain. Slaves lose everything in their chains, even the desire to be rid of them. Okay, but wait a minute. Isn't this also true of men in society? Isn't therefore there is a problem here that by focusing on the chains. So this is why and the next is they love their servitude as the companions of Odysseus. Ulysses loved their brutishness, right? And this is see the short treatise by Plutarch entitled "That Animals Reason," right? This is his. They love their servitude and their companions. And Plutarch's point is by animals reason because it is their association with human beings, if I remember correctly, in that sense. Um, if there are slaves by nature, therefore it is because they have been slaves contrary to nature. Force made the first slaves, their cowardice perpetuated it. And that cowardice is. But again, this is the problem. Doesn't his own argument here kind of point to the what's inherent in his own argument about that man? In other words, he's trying to legitimize it. He's not saying that by emphasizing chains as much. See, the problem here is by focusing on chains and focusing on this, we lose the thing. For Aristotle, it's not consent. It is what is the benefit? Who's benefiting, right? What legitimizes rule for Aristotle is that it's benefiting you, right? Or if the rule is benefiting you, benefiting people, and this is where Aristotle and Plato kind of agree. The difference is that for Aristotle, the ruler also needs to benefit, or for Plato, the ruler must sacrifice. I think Aristotle would think of Plato and say, no, no, it's unreasonable, right? Go see the book one of the Politics a YouTube series that was before this one, where I deal with this problem. Um, in other words, his point is that force made the first slaves. Their cowardice perpetuated. And therefore, its slavery is due to. But in other words, the difference between citizens and slaves is the difference between force, coercion, and consent. Therefore, what legitimizes is only consent. This is the perception of and this is where this is where consent is the only thing that legitimizes. This is right from both Locke and Hobbes, right? This is the whole point in this fundamental thing. Consent. What legitimizes is consent. For Aristotle, Plato, what legitimizes is the justice of the thing. For Hobbes, consent may be, following Locke. Hobbes will make the latest argument that that is the answer to the question of what is justice, things we consent to. Rousseau doesn't. Rousseau does not disagree. He asserts the same principle that consent is necessary, but he kind of distances himself and gives him the odor, the flavor of the Platonic view of the great justice as something bigger, right? So now he continues. I have said nothing about King Adam or Emperor Noah, father of three great monarchs who divided up the universe among themselves, as did the children of Saturn, who had been identified with them. I hope moderation will be appreciated, for I am a direct descendant of one of those princes, and perhaps of the eldest branch. Now, how am I to know whether, through the verification of titles, that I would not discover that I am the legitimate king of the human race? That's mocking Filmer, and it's mocking divine right of king. It's actually kind of also marking the argument of Aristotle, but Aristotle does not really argue about that the king of the human race is the master of this, or through the father in that sense. Uh, 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 Neither does Hobbes nor Grotius argue that what makes this idea that there's a one ruler or ultimate authority through the father, right? The legitimacy. Now, this is the point. This is what the question of. This is what he's arguing here. Is criticizing. I have not said about the legitimacy of inheritance through the father. Because what is what the argument is? King Adam. I'm a descendant. I'm the rightful descendant. I'm a descendant of this rightful line of fathers, heirs of this, descendants of this. That is the concept of legitimacy. This is what Filmer argues, that legitimacy means being the legitimate child of a father. I am the such son, the legitimate son of the father, and I inherit from my father what he had, my ancestor that I have had. And this is what he's not going to say anything about. He just mocks it. Right? And this ends us to chapter 3 on the right of the strongest. Right? If we end at number 2, we end up with the primitive societies, first societies. We get the family, we get slavery, and then the family, which is temporary, slavery, which is not natural, it's unjust. And then we get to this idea that there are rulers and masters, and the argument here is that yes and no, but if it's based upon force, that we're better, that I'm better than you, and I have the right to rule you, this is unjust for Rousseau in that sense, right? Chapter 3 on the right of the strongest. Right, again, this is making. I think there is the book 1. Thrasymachus' claim that justice is the advantage of the strongest. Right, the strongest is never strong enough to be the master forever, unless he transforms his force into right and obedience and the duty. So this is right from Hobbes. No one. It can't be by force, because no one is so strong that someone can kill you. You get old, you get weak. Rousseau's, Locke's, Hobbes's basic argument that only by the creation, in other words, everyone lives in fear in the state of nature, even the strong, because they're not always strong forever. They also can sleep, and they can be killed when they're sick or when they're sleeping. So everyone lives in fear, right? This is that idea. So that no one is ever strong enough to be master forever, unless he transform his force into what is just, and obedience, into duty. Right? Obedience no longer duty, but this is your duty. It becomes voluntary. What was done through force now becomes we agreed to it. But how isn't this? they come to love their chains, right? How is this not the same thing about the slaves up here, right? This is what leads people to this. That how is this not what happens here, not another just form of this, right? And this is just merely an act of cowardice. This is how some of the left will read it, right? This is how I don't think he means it this way, but his rhetoric will lead people to see it this way, right? This leads to the right of the strongest, a right that is in appearance taken ironically, and in principle really established. In other words, in principle, it is. In other words, the right. This leads to this idea that this situation, the strongest is never this, but they do this. But then, because this happens, that they do this, right? Actually, this is what Burke says happens, right? This movement from what's done by force, then over time, the deep, decent draperies of life, right? And good, so custom and habit and restraints, and what was done by force now is turned into duty. This idea that this leads to the right of the strongest, right? This that a right that is in appearance taken ironically, right? It's not really strong, but in principle is established. You won't. But won't anyone ever explain this word to us? About what was it about this word to us? What word to us? Force is physical power. I do not see what morality can result from its effects. In other words, force is physical power. Force is physical power. It's basically saying is force is a physical power. I do not see what morality can result from effects. Yielding to force is an act of necessity, not of will. So it's I have to. And this is this idea between the difference between necessity and will, which I think Kant will turn into the difference between the natural world, the world of nature, which is the world of forces and a necessity of facts of like gravity and things like this that you have no choice over, and whereas the realm of will, which is the realm of freedom, right? That's the Kantian dichotomy, and I think this is where Kant gets that from, and this point that Rousseau makes here. Yielding to force is an act of necessity, not will. At most, it is an act of prudence. Okay, prudence here now. The prudence here is not phronesis. Phronesis, I mean, prudence here is a Machiavellian usage of prudence. But a prudence here is, in the Greek would be phronesis. This is a kind of a knowing what is the right action, doing it the right way, the right time. This is the Latin to understand prudence also. The right way, the right how. It's knowing what is the good action, the correct action. So prudence is Machiavelli understands prudence in this way. In other words, it's calculation, it's cunning, right? It's kind of prudence is a kind of knowing what is something, therefore risk something dangerous and avoiding danger, seeking utility and avoiding the costs, right? It reminds me of the Saturday Night Live. Dana Carvey in the Saturday Night Live back in the 1980s played two characters. He played George Herbert Walker Bush, first senior, but he also played the church lady. And church lady in Bush wouldn't be prudent, which means it means it wouldn't be. It's too risky. It's something that is too risky, and that the prudent person. This is how Rousseau is using prudence here. That, in other words, it is. It's an act of prudence, and it's not. It's yielding to force, not necessity of will. So therefore, it's an act of. It's something that I'm doing because it's I do it because it's less dangerous. It's out of preservation. And in what sense could it be a duty? Now, duty implies will. This why this will. Here is where Kant emerges. The willing agent, duty and will, the connection of will. Will is something that the duty is something that the will commits itself to it. They must obey, right? So how is that if I do something because it's necessary, it's not something I need, and I do it only because if I don't do it, the cost is too high. my life will be lost and my security will be lost. So therefore, I don't do it because I want to do it. I do it because I must do it. Right? That's necessity, not choice, not will. Duty comes from choice in the sense, right? Okay. And that's morality. That's where morality comes from. This is why force can never be morality. Again, this is why there's that one, and I think you can see this in Rousseau. Rousseau is saying here, this is what's found in Kojève, right? This is why authority cannot be. Kojève, in his little notion of authority, says authority cannot rest on force. Okay, this very Rousseauian conception here. Let us suppose this allied right. Um, let us suppose this alleged right for a moment. Let's suppose this alleged right that it was the strongest. Right. I have the authority. I say that what comes from it is nothing, but inexplicable confusion. In other words, that right makes right. No, no, no. As soon as force makes right, the effect changes along with the cause. Any force that overcomes the first one succeeds to its right. As soon as one can disobey without punishment, one can do it legitimately. And since the strongest is always right, the only thing to do is to make oneself the strongest, right? So again, this is the thing that is why this is a kind of self. You know, we have a problem here. That if right makes strongest right, but then okay, but then who's strongest? And that's that changes whoever is strongest, right? And therefore, what you have to do is this: instead of finding out what's right, in other words, um, this is why it can't be a duty in that sense. This is why it's not a thing. As soon as force makes it right, right, effects change with the cause, right? Any force that overcomes the first one succeeds to it, right? But in other words, if I overcome that, then I'm this. This is now what is right. That overcomes that. This is now what is right. Isn't this kind of Hegel's the dialectic in Hegel's in what how Kojève in both his um, notion of authority and other works explain the dialectic and a master-slave dialectic in that sense that they become the stronger, they win. One side wins the debate and becomes master in that sense. Okay, and as soon as one can disobey without punishment, one can do so legitimately, right? Because that's since the strongest is always right, the only thing it is to do to make oneself stronger. But what is right that? But what is a right that perishes when the force ceases? The argument goes right. If it is necessary to obey by force, one needs not obey by duty. And if one is no longer forced to obey, one is no longer obligated to do so. So obedience is not a longer. In other words, he's saying you can't only do it by being forced to do it. Then if not, you don't have no obligation to obey. In other words, it's not because you do it by duty; you do it because you're forced. But if once there's no force in there, if one is no longer forced to obey, one is no longer obligated to do so. It is apparent then that this word right adds nothing to force. It is meaningless here. And again, this is again, I would argue where Kojève will get his idea, and also Kant will get this idea too, and Hegel too, right? Obey those in power, right? Obey those in power. If that means yield to force, the precept is good, but superfluous. I reply that it will never be violated. In other words, there's no possibility of violence. No, again, this is that idea for Rousseau, Kant, or Kojève. I mean, Kojève about the authority has to have the right to say no to it. Yeah, right. Again, this is again very, very much. He's influenced by Rousseau here. All power comes from God. I admit it, but so does all illness. Right? It's mockery. All power comes from God, but therefore all illness. Right? Does this mean it is forbidden to call the doctor? Since okay, he's mocking it. I can't call the doctor. So if I can call the doctor for this, I can do something about it. If a brigand takes me by surprise at the edge of the woods, must I not only give up my purse by force? Am I obliged by my conscience to give it, even if I could keep it away? Keep it away. After all, the pistol he holds is also a power. The pistol is a force, right? That's power. So in other words, that can I, if I can, in other words, am I forced to obey? I could opt not to, right? Am I obliged by conscience to give it even if I could keep it away? A pistol is authority. So if that's power, if you have to obey because of power, that's not legitimate. This is again. This is why again. I think this is that line. And then last, thus, my original question still remains: what makes it legitimate? Chapter 4: Slavery. Since no human has any natural authority over his fellow man, so there's no natural authority. Hobbes, that's Hobbes, right? Hobbes. And since force produces no right, so one, no natural authority. Two, force does not produce right. There remains only conventions as the basis of all legitimate authority among men. If private men, says Grotius, can alienate his freedom and enslave himself to a master, why can't a whole people alienate its freedom and subjugate itself to a king, right? Now, I think this is an interesting thing. I think that's Grotius says this, but also Hobbes says this, right? That is the social contract. That is the social contract. And this is what he talks about, right? There are many equivocal words in this equivocal words in this that needs to be explained. But let us limit ourselves to the word alienate. To alienate is to give or to sell. That's what common English law term is, to give or to sell. Now, a man who makes himself another's slave does not give himself; he sells himself, at least for his subsistence. But why does a people sell itself? Far from furnishing the subsistence of his subjects, a king derives his own only from them. And according to Rabelais, a king does not live cheaply. Right? This is Rabelais, the great. Again, a king does not live cheaply. So therefore, this is kind of an anti-monarchical position. The king sells it. If I give it to the king is going to live expensively, but remember, the purpose of the king is to provide security and safety for people. So it's not that and that this is the price of his willingness to do that. So this is not good. There must be alternatives. In other words, I think he's saying, it says, do the subjects give their persons then on condition that their goods will be taken too? I do not see what remains for them to preserve. So if they give their goods, what is to preserve? Again, this is very Lockean too. This is he's kind of agreeing with Locke. But if the king can take their goods, what is there to preserve? This is the criticism of monarchy in essence. This is the kind of criticism is not they give up themselves to be ruled by a king who is going to live so lavishly and expensively that that in order to pay him, he's going to have to take away their property, which means why would they do this? What is to preserve, right? And it will be said that the despot guarantees civil tranquility to a subject, right? Perhaps so. But what have they gained if the wars that his ambitions bring on them, if his insatiable greed, if the harassment of his ministers are greater torment than their dissension would be? In other words, civil tranquility. But what happens if the cost of civil tranquility, these wars and the greed of his ministers, insatiable greed and the harassment of his ministers? So therefore, the gain by the wars his ambition brings on, his insatiable greed and the harassment of his ministers are greater torment, are greater than the conflict, the civil guarantees, the civil tranquilities. What have they gained if this tranquility is one of their miseries? Life is tranquil in jail cells too. That is the reason enough to like them. In other words, The Greeks lived tranquility shut up in the Cyclops cave as they awaited their turn to be devoured, right? And tranquility enough. This is kind of this is the leftist the idea, that, the social, but again, this is the problem is utility. He's nevertheless saying there's going to be utilities. That the difference here is that the argument is the king here is doing it. And the question is, what is the king doing? How is the ruler ruling? Is the rule producing real tranquility, or is it a false tranquility? It is the tranquility of being about to be devolved. It's not a real safety. It's a tranquil. It's not at this moment horrible, but yeah, trust me. How is it tranquil being devoured? Okay. It's the tranquility of a prison in that sense. You're not where you're or a death camp in that sense. Yeah. But maybe not. In other words, you got to be killed, right? Right. To say that a man gives himself gratuitously is to say something absurd and inconceivable. So, if gives himself gratuitously means freely, right? Such an act is illegitimate and null, if only because he who does so is not in his right mind. So, in other words, he's not in his right mind. No rational person would give himself away for nothing, would sell himself freely for nothing, gratuitously, like a tip. I'm rewarding you. I'm giving it to you. Gratuity, right? A tip. I'm giving it to you. A gift. People don't, gives himself freely to a slave or a subject. Does not do this, right? Because this is illegitimate and null. Because why? No, he's not in his right mind. To say the same thing about the entire people is to suppose a people of madmen. Madness does not make right. So not only does force not make right, in other words, if things cannot be in your interest or your utility or your good, it cannot be. Therefore, it must be done because you're not thinking correctly. Madness, you're not judgment. You're not of the right mind, and collective madness is does not. In other words, not madness, which is not being in the right mind, does not make right. Does not make something right. Even if everyone could alienate himself, he could not alienate his children. Men are born, they are born men and free. Their freedom belongs to them. No one but themselves has the right to dispose of it. Again, this is Hobbes and Locke, right? This is this radicalizing of this argument of Hobbes and Locke. The argument is once they're in society, do they still maintain their natural freedom? Now, Rousseau seems to suggest that no, they always retains their natural freedom, their freedom in that sense. Their freedom belongs to them. No one but themselves has a right to dispose of it. So, but they have the right to dispose of it, okay? But before they have reached their age of reason, the father can, in their names, stipulate conditions for their preservation, for their well-being, but he cannot give them irrevocably and unconditionally, because such a gift is contrary to the ends of nature and exceeds the right of paternity, right? So therefore, again, this is Locke. Locke's chapter on writes this. This is very much Locke agrees with Locke. For the arbitrary government to be legitimate, it would therefore be necessary for the people in each generation to be master of its acceptance. In other words, of each generation to be master of its acceptance or rejection. So in other words, they would have to agree, each generation have to agree to either accept or reject their rulers. But then this government would no longer be arbitrary. Okay, listen. In other words, this is why there's no arbitrary government in that sense. For arbitrary government to be legitimate, it would have to be what? It'd have to be each generation have to accept or reject it. But then this government is no longer arbitrary in that sense. To renounce one's freedom is to renounce one's status as a man and the rights of humanity and even its duties. So therefore, you cannot renounce your freedom in that sense. You can never give your freedom away. Freedom is inalienable. Now, there's a difference. Is freedom means? What does freedom mean to do? I mean, Hobbes' freedom means the right to do whatever you want. This freedom you have to alienate. Because if you don't alienate the right to do whatever you want, this leads to the war of all against all eventually. Locke and Rousseau. This is where Locke and Rousseau thinks, no, 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 you've got to keep them freedom. But what does liberty mean? Liberty means your property. You have to have your right to property. Even he agrees to that. Having if people have no property, then it's no longer why am I going to do this, right? Um, so therefore, this is a kind of understanding that liberty here now is inalienable. You can't not deny it. But what is meant by freedom in this sense? This forces us to ask with the question: what is okay? If you cannot alienate freedom, but what is freedom that you can't? Because okay, there is no possible compensation for anyone who renounces everything. So it's not that you renounce. It's that there's no compensation that for everything you give it. For such a renunciation is incompatible with the nature of man, and taking away all his freedom of will. Okay, freedom of will that he's able to choose. In other words, freedom of will, the ability to choose, is taking away all his morality, taking away all morality from his actions. Finally, it is vain and contradictory convention to stipulate absolute authority on one side and on the other unlimited obedience. So absolute authority, in other words, it's kind of vain and contradictory. You have absolute authority on one side and absolute obedience on the other. Isn't it clear that the one is in no way engaged towards a person from whom one has the right to demand everything? So in other words, it is clear that one is in no way engaged towards a person from whom one has the right to demand everything, and doesn't this condition alone, without equivalent and without exchange, entail the nullification of the act? In other words, there's no relation, there's no what do you call engagement, there's no wage engagement, there's no relation, I have no connection with this, and therefore how can this act occur? How can this without equivalent or without exchange? In other words, there's no equivalent, there's no exchange. This means that this act of me demanding you to do this is null. For what right would my slave have against me, since all he has belongs to me, and his right being mine, my right against myself is a meaningless word, right? My right against myself is a meaningless word. It doesn't mean anything. My right against myself, he has nothing. He has nothing against me. I own him, since all he has is mine, and his right being mine, my right against myself is meaningless. Right? Grotius and other derive the war from the origins of alleged right of slavery. Right, this is war comes because of this right, or maybe the opposite way around. Slavery is the merge of war. I think that's the reality. As the victor has the right to kill the vanquished. According to them, the latter can buy back his life at the cost of his freedom. A convention all the more legitimate in that it is profitable for both of them, right? But it is clear that this alleged right to kill the vanquished is in no way resulting from the state of war. Men are not natural enemies. Well, this is where Hobbes and Rousseau kind of disagree, right? Men are not natural enemies, if only because when living in their original independence, they do not have sufficient stable relationships among themselves to constitute either a state of peace or a state of war. In other words, peace and war are social relations. Man in the state of nature is not social. And therefore, there's no stable relations. They do not have sufficient stable relationships to form social bodies. War and peace are social relationships. It is the relationship between things, not between men, that constitutes war. And the state of war cannot arise from simple personal relations, but but only from proprietal relations. In other words, relations. Private war is between one man and another, can exist neither in the state of nature, where there is no stable property, nor in the social state, where everything is on the authority of the laws. Individual combats, duels, private encounters that are not acts that constitute a state. Whereas these things are not acts that constitute a state. As regard to private wars authorized by the establishment of King Louis IX of France and suspended by the peace of God, they are abuses of feudal government, an absurd system, if there was ever one, contrary to the principles of natural right and even good polity, good regime, good order. War is not, therefore, a relation between man and man, but between state and state, in which private individuals are enemies only by accident, not as men, nor even as citizens, but as soldiers. Now, this word citizen is important. I'm going to stop here. Not as members of the homeland, but as its defenders. Now, I'm defending the homeland. I'm enemy because I'm defending the homeland. I'm not. They're enemies by accident, not as men. Not because they're fellow. They're not as enemies even as citizens in that sense, but as soldiers. Now, the Romans, who understood and respected the right of war better than any nation in the world, were scrupulous in this respect. That a citizen was not allowed to serve as a volunteer unless he had explicitly engaged himself against his enemy and against a particular enemy by name. When a legion in which Cato the Younger was serving for the first time under Pompilus had been recognized, Cato the Elder wrote to Pompilus that he wanted his son to continue to serve under him. Pompilus would have him take the military oath again, because the first oath being annulled, he could no longer bear arms against the enemy. The same Crito wrote his son to be careful not to appear in combat without swearing this new oath. I know that in the siege of Calcium and other specific events, it can be raised in contradiction to this, but I cite laws and practices. The Romans were the people whom least transgressed their laws, and they're the only people who had very such fine ones. So therefore, in that sense. Finally, each state can have the own. Finally, each state can have only other states, and not men as enemies, since no true relation can be established between things of differing natures. This principle even conforms with the established maxims of all ages, and with the constant practice of all civilized people. Declarations of war are not so much warnings to those in power as to their subjects, right? Not to power, but as the subject. The foreigner, whether he be a king, a private individual, or people, who rob, kills, and imprisons subjects without declaring war on the prince, is not an enemy but a brigand. Even in the midst of war, a just prince may well seize everything in the enemy's country that belongs to the public, but he respects the persons and goods of private individuals. He respects rights on which his own are based. So therefore, the private property can't take part. In the end, being the end of war being destruction of the enemy state, one has the right to kill its defenders as long as they're armed. But as soon as they lay down their arms and surrender, since they cease to be enemies or instruments of the enemy, they simply become men once again, and one no longer has a right to their lives. Sometimes it is possible to kill the state without killing a single one of its members. War confers no right that is not necessary to its end. These principles are not those of Grotius. They are not based on the authority of the poets, but are derived from the nature of things and are based on reason. So therefore, now he's giving the argument. What he's argued here is not based on Grotius. It's based on reason. Not based on the authority of the poets either, but derived from the nature of things, based on reason. With regard to the right of conquest, it has no basis other than the law of the strongest. If war does not give the victor the right to massacre the vanquished people, this right he does not have cannot establish the right to enslave them. One only has the right to kill the enemy when he cannot be made a slave. The right to make him a slave does not come, then, from the right to kill him. It is therefore an inequitous exchange, an unequal exchange, to make him buy his life over which he has no right at the cost of his freedom. By establishing the right of life and death on the right of slavery, and the right of slavery on the right of life and death, isn't it clear that one falls into a vicious cycle? In other words, I've done this, and this is why he destroys the argument that okay, I agree to slavery by consent, and that's I've conquered the right to conquer, so I'm vanquished. Therefore, this is a fact. Or this happens. It's not a right. He said something like this it might occur, but it's not going to be a right. Even assuming this terrible right to kill everyone, even assuming this terrible right to kill everyone, I say that a man enslaved in war or a conquered people is in no way obliged towards his master, except to obey for as long as he is forced to do so. In other words, he's going to do so. But he's still at war in that sense. He's still in that's lock again. Lock. See my lock again. Lock. Point. In taking the equivalent of his life, the victor has not spared it. Rather than to kill him purposelessly, he he has killed him usefully. Therefore, far from the victor having acquired any authority over him, in addition to force, the state of war subsists between them as before. The relation itself is in effect, and the customs of the right of war suppose that there has not been a peace treaty. There was war, no peace treaty. Only when the war ends is when there's a peace treaty, and there's a consent of this, right? They make a convention, true, but that convention, far from destroying the state of war, assumes its continuation. So therefore, the right that they make of that is not a end of the conflict, but it's continuation of the selling. The agreement that is made that I sell myself for my life is not. It is an agreement, but it's not a. It assumes not the end of the war, but it continues the war in that sense, right? The war. Thus, from a very from thus from every vantage point, the right of slavery is null, not merely because it's illegitimate, but because it is absurd and meaningless. Right? This is how he's done. These words, slavery and right, are contradictory. They are mutually exclusive. They can't be done. Whether it is said by one man to another or by a man to a people, the following speech will always be equally senseless. So, in other words, anyone who says this, either by man to another man, or one man to another, or a man to a people, I make a convention with you that it is entirely at your expense and entirely for my benefit, that I shall observe for as long as I want, and that you shall observe for as long as I want. Again, this is arbitrary. It's like this is senseless because it violates. It argues it violates all these principles. It makes no sense. Why? What? There's no utility here. There's no gain. It's court. In other words, I have no. The other party has no. A contract implies obligations on all parties. Here, there's no obligation on the party that's issuing this. I make a convention with you that is entirely at your expense and entirely for my benefit, right? So that's not, you have to get, no, there has to be some benefit for you. If there's no benefit for you, then okay, this is, why would anyone rationally choose it? Do it. No one will choose it at that point. And I shall observe it as long as I want, and you shall observe it for as long as I want. So again, what I want is what you should get. And that's how this ends. Well, this has been long. I maybe should have made shorter chapters. If you like it, hit the like button, share it out your social media, get it out there. get out there so that you know who's out there and doing it. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe and get others to subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you get notifications about my new videos and things like this. The other thing is that if you didn't like it, you can always say, no, I didn't like it, but say why in the comments so I can get, at least I understand what's the reason, what's wrong, maybe I can improve. Another thing is you can follow me in the social media links, my social media links below. You can also follow me below with my academic links, the links of academic social media and about my research and my work and things like this. Another thing you can do is if you wish to help me do what I do, you can become a patron or a partner in Subscribestar or Patreon. List the links, like the links list below. This is where you can help me do what I do by financially contributing. As little as I think $5 a month is the maximum I think I have. Nothing big. Um, of course, I don't have many people. I think I had one person once, and it kind of broke away. And I didn't really do anything. Okay, maybe this is like, oh no, what happened here? I don't know. Another thing is, those of you who want to help me, want to help, but don't want to become a member, we can do is this: you can buy one of my books listed below. Buy it for yourself, or buy it for a friend or a student you know. Again, the Lulu book is the one that if you buy it by Lulu. All the books are available Amazon or Barnes& Noble, other bookstores. But if you want to buy the Lulu book, please buy it by Lulu because I will get the profit that Amazon, the bookstore, gets. Okay, that's if we want to help me. Well, that's it. Well, again, this is going to be Mondays and Wednesdays. We will turn to the next chapter of our thing, looking at the next part. We're going to be probably dividing it this. I might make it a little shorter because I think we went too long. Um, we'll see what happens. No, I think I made the videos. I'll keep this the vision I divided it. Um, well, take care. Have a good day. See you soon.